Hello, welcome to my Demi Daily Deep Dive. I am DBJ for those who do not know me and will see this video. I'll do a little preamble before I really get into today's live stream. Today is going to be Tuesday, and Tuesdays are tips and tricks. But a little preamble for those who don't know, I used to do a ton of my videos in a wizard's robe, and I don't know why or how I misplaced it, but I found my wizard's robe from like years ago. So, so just a little something silly. Anyway, let's get into the blame game. Kind of a weird title, but follow me on this, because if you know me, and I know you do. I like to take little tiny things, little small things, and expand upon them. So the idea for this Tips and Tricks Tuesday is that sometimes success and failure is not the fault of the person, the protagonist and antagonist. Sometimes you can actually place those blames on outside factors, and then those outside factors can be something you can use to like enhance or twist or modify or motivate the story in another direction. So as always, I have to give you an example. This is kind of a sarcastic example because I remember reading this on the thread, and it comes up every once in a while. I think it's kind of silly and a little bit sad. So let me get into it. Player character says, I want to sneak up on the bad guy and, like, stab him in the back or attack him from behind. Player character rolls the dice. They roll their D20. They roll a 1. And then somebody says, well, instead of stabbing him in the back and carving out his heart from his spine, you gently caress him from behind, and he enjoys the touch, or something silly like that, right? It's along those lines, which I find to be it's a little sarcastic, and there's no problem with people having fun in their games, but I think it takes away from the player's actions and starts to, do this sarcastic, silly kind of twist, because, it's taking the failure and then twisting it in such a way that it makes fun of the person taking the action in the first place. And I'm not saying that people do not, they don't fumble themselves or are always perfect, or their actions are always exactly set up the way they want to. But it's like, if someone is trying to convince a king to allow them to pass through their territory, and in their charisma attempt they roll a 1, it doesn't mean that they spit on the king. It means that however they were trying to convince this king to pass through their territory, it utterly fails. Here's an opportunity as a dungeon master, game master, or even a player, if you give them a lot of player agency, to twist what's going on. For example, what if someone rolls a 1, and it's not because they weren't impassioned, it's not because the person failed and said something stupid or farted or something dumb like that, right? In the king's presence. What if it utterly failed because an advisor started speaking in the king's ear, and the king just completely did not even hear you? Or an advisor comes up and passes the king a note, here's what you have to say, and is like, get out of my chambers, I don't want to hear this ever again. And now there's this little piece of evidence that's like, well, wait a minute, this guy was on our side. We went to convince him. The most charismatic member of our group made this impassioned plea to allow us to go through his territory, and it completely changes his mind, right? It utterly failed. What happened? Now's an opportunity to insert something into the story. Same thing when it comes to combat. Combat's the big thing, right? I said this in a very old video. I'm going to say it again. player character uh, grabs the dice. They go to shoot the orc chieftain in the throat with their bow. They roll a 20, natural 20. Great. Woohoo. Okay. Go to grab some damage dice, roll a damage dice, and double ones, right? Complete failure. But you can reshape that encounter. Maybe the elven archer pulls the bow back, boom, fires at the orc chieftain. The blade of the bow slices past the orc chieftain's throat. The orc chieftain is like, got this slight, cut across his throat and is like holding his neck. Everyone's like sitting back in awe. And then instead the elf is just like, the next one's going to go in your eye unless you back off or something like that, right? You can always twist the narrative to fit the scene by making things and describing things in a narrative way so that you don't lose the momentum of the scene, and don't use the opportunity to use one or more of the player characters' failures as a way of browbeating them or using it to boy, I'm trying to search for the words to embarrass them. You want them to come back, and sometimes failure after failure after failure on the dice is just very, very depressing. And instead of blaming all of the failures on their skills, on their abilities, maybe something happens. It could be a downpour, it could be windy, earthquakes, rock slides or something. In a titanic battle, two opponents are fighting each other, and it just so happens that the clashing of armies around them flows past them and knocks into them, causing them to miss their swings and move around and such. It could just be that someone rolls a 2 trying to hit the dragon turtle, that the dragon turtle's tail's lashing around and there's just no way to get to this creature, or it just deflects off of its hardened shell, or a spine or something, and just use those opportunities to create more drama. Now, I haven't given you too many other outside factors, but imagine some more of these things where this is a fantasy realm. Fantasy things can happen. For example, let's go introspective. Maybe the player character is distracted by a memory that they've had a traumatic event that overwhelms them at this very moment. Maybe the player character has had a traumatic experience or a memory, and this particular event is the one thing that draws them back. Pru says, I had a player who hated the fumble crit fail because he said it doesn't make sense that someone that well trained would all of a sudden fail that big. In many ways, I agree, because I love, matter of fact, I use fumble crit tables too. Pru goes on to say that, but when I went, it could be external sources making him fail. Like, these, I don't know, the heavy winds are blowing the banners and tapestries around, and it wraps around your wrist, flinging the weapon from your hand or something like that. I do think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that someone swings a sword and they stab themselves as something that happens commonly. That's not a very common thing, especially with someone that is extremely well trained. But you can have situations where people trip, they fall, they drop their items, spells go awry, things like that. And then there's like little micro objectives, like you swing your sword, you stab the creature, the sword gets jammed into the creature's plates and is ripped from your hand. So you hit, you do some damage, or maybe you don't do any damage, but your sword is lodged into the golem or the dragon turtle scales or something like that. These are opportunities to like twist and turn things so that they can become, maybe someone can take advantage of the so-called failure. weapons can fall, they can break, straps can break on shields, things like that. I don't have a problem with using those crit and fail tables. I just think sometimes you can get a little gonzo with them, and I think that's not something that wants to make like new players or new to you players want to come back to the table when they fail. Using lock picks to pick a lock, you could break a lock pick inside the lock. You can drop it and it rolls under the door. It could make noise. It could reset the trap that you just disarmed. There are I think there's opportunity to have variations in a success or failure. Failing on a stealth check does not mean you're automatically seen. Maybe it just means that you make a noise that the guards think might just be a cat or something, and they go in to investigate. Prue goes on to say, I don't do fumble tables, but I encourage my players to narrate what goes wrong, and they often get a boon for doing so. We like to use a scatter die inspired from Warhammer 40K. Yeah, the funny thing is, statistically speaking, as an armchair statistician, if you ask a player to describe their failures, more often than not, it's far more worse than a DM or a GM will ever describe. It's just one of those things, it could be the high winds blow debris in someone's face, or you are trying to recall this information about this arcane forest, and for some reason you just unfortunately superimpose it on something else. It could be that you're completely wrong about the arcane forest. You just read it in a book that wasn't up to date. It's not a big deal. Maybe you go to convince the shopkeep to offer you this item at a very low discount, and the shopkeep suddenly realizes that, hey, this item might be far more valuable than I thought it was, and triples the price on you, not because of your attitude, but it's like, oh, I can make a profit on this. I bet there's others who have just as much interest or something, without making the failure due to incompetence. I guess that's where I'm trying to go with this. Like, player characters, there should be an assumed professionalism and expertise from your players, depending on what kind of game you're playing and the skills that they have. If you're using percentile system and they've got an 80% in piloting, they're not ones to just fumble around at the controls, right? But they don't have control over the outside sources, whether it's they're flying through an asteroid field, or they are individuals that are highly trained. We here in the States, we like to say that one of the most elite military groups are the Navy SEALs. Their failures aren't based on their incompetence. It's almost always based on outside influences, whether it's equipment failure, whether it's weather failure, whether it's situational failures, where you have a great opportunity inside of a village or a city or a town or a modern city is to have innocent bystanders go on by. Kids on bikes, vehicles drive by. Someone's got a person in their sights, they get ready to shoot them, and a delivery truck rolls on by, and boom, the bullet goes into the delivery truck, and you're like, oh man, I can't believe that happened at that very moment. Or someone's jogging down the street or riding their bike, and they fall into the target, so you miss with your sniper rifle, and it's not because you didn't have them in their sights, and it's not because the person dodged, but this other third party situation, third party conundrum takes and twists the whole scenario. And that's really what I wanted to say. Like, it may not have anything to do with the story, although your player characters may assume it does, but you can always use the failure to bring the world alive, right? So yesterday I talked about were creatures, and I started going into swamps. Who's to say that an alligator isn't, or a turtle or frogs or something it is in the swamps. Who's to say that some, brightly colored tropical bird doesn't fly by and distract the target, or that errant vines or leaves or tree branches fall down and disrupt targeting someone or following someone, or the muddy path you're trying to track, and this person's an expert ranger, but they don't have any control over the plant growth and what happens when they are not there. There's lots of territorial creatures in swamps that if you're tracking prey, who's to say that's what Prue says that, by the way. Who's to say that one of those territorial creatures doesn't interpose itself in the way of you tracking something else, and then you lose sight of your prey, right? It's not because you failed to do it. It's that, like Prue says, there's plenty of ambush predators. I'm trying to catch you with some good timing here. Yeah, there's lots of ambush predators, and those predators need not be how could it statistically powerful, although you could throw them in there, right? You could have a swampy version of a giant frog or massive alligator, but you don't really need to have that. It could very well just be a poisonous snake, or rattlesnake, or some kind of a cobra or python just happens to drop from a tree, and then that's the thing that causes the failure for the player character as they're performing the action. Maybe they're trying to apply some kind of healing method to an ally that was injured, and when the python drops from the tree, that's the reason why they rolled their minimum dice on their healing attempt or something like that. It wasn't because they failed and they were incompetent. It was because they were distracted by something else, which might require the use or expenditure of another spell slot or something in 5e or whatever, to maximize those points or whatnot. Also, there's the idea that how can I say this? You could wrap around the successes and failures based on the player characters' backgrounds. So, for example, a cleric, someone faithful, someone who draws their power from divine sources, may be given. This may be a sign from a divine source that they are or are not going down the correct path. If you've ever seen the old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Conan, you'll know that Conan the Destroyer has a fight, and he worships the god Crom, who's like god of like war and battle, and sieges or something of that nature. And he says to Crom, bless me in my battle, and if you do not, then to hell with you. And he starts fighting, and at one point, this beautiful woman in a corona of bright light, as Conan is getting beaten down, appears and says, do you want to live forever? And that bright light distracts, I guess, an enemy or something like that. And he draws his sword and blocks the attack and then starts to fight back. Now, that doesn't mean Conan has some magical ability or that he's got a divine caster. It could be that he failed, and then is like, he's this barbarian character has been knocked down. He's like, man. And then the game master may have taken that opportunity to say, okay, here's a good story thing. How about I bring this person back from the past that he really loved and admired, and here's another opportunity to roll initiative again or something like that, and allow him to come back when he rolls a 19 on his parry attack or shove or striking back at his enemy, and just throwing something in there to manipulate something. If the person's a cleric, maybe they're knocked down by the enemy and they look down into a puddle of water and they see a reflection of themselves, and in that reflection suddenly an image of an avatar of their divine host appears and tells them, this is not a time for you to be on your hands and knees. This is a time for you to stand proud and show them who you are, that the pride of Palazar, should be shown to everyone. It is not it's not how many times you fail, it is how many times you stand up and fight for what is right, or something like that. Just coming off the top of my head. But I'm saying you can take that failure and warp it into something that can be story related. Also, especially with um, statistically, single dice tend to be far more swingy than dice pools. And so there are times where you can have players in your game and the dice just are not going their way. It has nothing to do with their character build, has nothing to do with the story. It's just the dice. A D20 is very swingy, and you can roll multiple twos and threes and fives and fours over the course of a game and it's just like, the person just can't catch a break. And here's a good opportunity for you as the dungeon master to like give them a little something, give them a little enthusiasm, give them a little story element, so that their failures aren't this constant like, oh, you're just stupid, you don't know what you're doing, your character just looks like they're incompetent. Yeah, I don't like the idea of using it something at 100% always, meaning like all failures are the character's fault, all successes are the character's fault as well. For example, a player character may want to make a character that seems incompetent, but they pull it out of their ass at the right moment. So, for example, someone might want to make a wizard who, or a sorcerer or something, who's not very, they're playing it as if they're not very competent in their abilities, but their critical die rolls are coming across like they are. And it could just be that they are role playing and narrating the character as if they're very lucky, but the end result is that they're causing these very these critical hits, these really powerful blasts or something like that. And so the player character could play it like, oops, I didn't realize I was going to do that. But the die rolls, the player knows what's going on, the character does not. Right. So you could play a character who's the farm boy that's just engaged in the military, even though their character's playing a fighter. Right. So the farm boy grabs his pitchfork and he's fighting, and gets a critical hit, but instead is like, well, I duck down, I stick my pitchfork in the ground and duck down, and then the enemy accidentally impales themselves on the pitchfork, killing themselves, instead of the person saying, well, I'm an expert with my pitchfork, and I stab them in the throat. If you can follow me on that. Also, handing out critical hits can be kind of boring if the only thing you're doing is just applying double damage, right? I think critical hits can incorporate any number of things. As a game master, you can do what you want, and often doing what you want seems like this, like, you can't just make up the rules on your own and whatnot. But really, doing what you want is should always be consistent with the narrative and the setting, right? So a critical hit could include things like disarming your enemy, blinding them, tripping them, stunning them, knocking them unconscious, having them spin around or get shoved down, or shoved back, or knocked into a trap, or any number of things that can be included with a critical hit that makes a lot of sense, right? So striking the orc chieftain with your battle axe may also cut through his armor and his shield, or cut the person's hand off and they drop their, enchanted sword, or the orc chieftain is struck in the head so hard with the hammer that it stuns them for a couple of rounds, and you grab a D4 and roll it, and they're just, knocked for a loop as his eyes roll in the back of his head or something. Adding those little benefits in there, especially if it's appropriate to the scene or the narrative or the situation, really makes a lot of sense. So the orc chieftain, maybe you're fighting around a lair of giant spiders, and he gets knocked back into the spider's web and gets trapped in it, or the fireball goes off and sets fire to the encampment that the goblinoids are in, or something of that nature. Whether it's a computer hacker that tries to hack into a system, and by the way, they also make a back door into the system that they can use later. You can add all kinds of little benefits to those crits where double damage doesn't really encompass what the person is trying to do. Having someone who, who's, you strike the enemy and also their leg breaks. You strike the enemy and a rib, punctures their lung, or you strike the creature in the throat, the chimera in the dragon's head, and now it can't breathe fire anymore, or has a hard time doing it with your blade impaled in its jaw, something like that. Just allowing those things to happen will really enhance the scene, especially if your players are describing things that their characters want to achieve, and there really isn't a rule for it, but they attempt to do it. So for example, maybe the golem is very hard to fight, but someone gets a crit on the golem, and although it doesn't do a lot of damage to the golem, maybe it trips the golem over a statue or an altar, and the golem has a hard time getting back up, which might be a good opportunity for the player character to run for it and escape, or make a tactical retreat or something from the enemy. Knocking someone into water and they start to flounder around, or even drown, or get carried away by a raging river. Having a tapestry get pulled off the wall over someone's eyes, and they're temporarily blinded till they throw the tapestry off with an action or something like that. Those are all things that can be used to shape and twist the narrative without just making it the blame game. Sometimes it's just, it's not your fault. It's something from the outside. So yes, I normally make very, very long ones. This is a long one too, almost a half an hour, but that's basically what I wanted to say. Thanks, Prue, for engaging. Anyone else, the other individual I think who's watching, thank you. Anyone else who takes part in watching my videos, thank you very much. I am DBJ. I call myself the third pillarist because my passion is using the environment, that third pillar of gaming. The first and second pillar is combat and social interactions. So I use those to, thanks, Prue. Have a nice day. Thank you. You too, man. Or young lady. Doesn't matter to me. I appreciate you in any way. Distracted myself there. So yes, I do some writing. I'm trying to, I do these live streams mainly as a passion project, because I get a lot of sparks of ideas from interacting with you guys. So if you have anything to say, you got some questions, you just want to give a little shout out, thank you very much. I would appreciate it. I go live at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I think that's GMT -5 or 4, something like that. So anyway, I contribute writing to Critical Hit Publishing. My baby is the Cinematic Environs. They're on Drive-Thru-RPG, or you could just look on YouTube and type in Cinematic Environs and see what they're about. So I would appreciate that as well. And there's links below if you want to check that out. So anyway, I'm DBJ. As always, I like to deep dive each day. Thank you for joining me. You guys have a very good day. Thank you so much.